good morning mga ka-tribu. I'm Chito Lozada
And
we have as our guest today the former Secretary of Finance of the Republic of the Philippines from 1994 to 1998 during the presidency of Fidel Ramos as Chairman and Chief Executive Officer. He's also the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of the Development Bank of the Philippines during the presidency of Cory Aquino. So we have here Mr. Bobby De Ocampo.
we have Mr. Roberto de Ocampo, the man at the helm currently of the Philippine Veterans Bank. Thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor for me to be able to sit here and chat with you.
Yeah. And very refreshing insights.
And even before the program started,
The fireworks started.
Fireworks started.
With our little informal chat.
But before your chairmanship of Philippine Veterans Bank, sir, can you tell us a little about your just a quick overview about your vast involvement in the public?
You know, interestingly enough,
public and private financial sectors.
Yes. My public service began many years ago in the 70s. And at that time, I had just come back from graduate school in both the United States and in London. I was probably one of a very small handful of people that went to the London School of Economics. But I came back here holding these two diplomas, and rather than telling the world, hey, these are important diplomas, who is the highest bidder for my services, I was looking for a challenge more than I was looking for an income.
Okay.
And at that time, then Executive Secretary Alejandro Melchor heard through my father, because both of them were on the board of DBP at the time, that he had a crazy son who was looking for a challenge, even though he had these degrees that could have earned him income right away. You know?
How old were you then?
26.
26, yes.
So what happened is Secretary Melchor offered me the idea, the job, of being one of 3 people to spearhead the implementation of the rural electrification program of the Philippines.
Wow.
It had a law that had been introduced by then Senator, former Vice President, Manny Pelaez, but there was no implementation to go with it. And so we were tasked. And my part of it was to set up the management and financial systems of what was going to be the rural electric cooperatives of the country. At that time, only 30% of our country had electricity, believe it or not. This is 1971, 72, 30%.
30%.
Only 20% had electric power.
This was during the time of Marcos?
Yes.
Senior Marcos.
Yeah, this was Senior Marcos.
It's practically only Manila.
And of that 30%,
30%.
of the 30%, 70% were all in the Meralco franchise area. All you had to do in those days, all you had to do in those days was drive out of Manila for an hour or so, and you'd already be in a place that only had, let's say, electricity between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m.
Unbelievable.
And if you went farther, let's say Mindanao, then things were by Petromax. They used to call it Pet. So that's how I got started in public service, looking for a challenge and getting a job whose pay was lower than my father's driver. But I found
government.
There was a managerial job in the public sector, but
I found it exciting because I ended up going to literally every nook and cranny of the Philippines because it was rural electrification.
How did you travel during the time? That was in the 1970s.
That compensates.
It was in the 70s, no?
70s. Eisenhower. There was a 20.
I have an Eisenhower then.
Jeep. Yung Vietnam
surplus.
Oh. And we'd go through, we'd go through Lanao.
Motorized outrigger.
And then when you go out to the country, you'd sleep in the guest house on a Kawayan type of bed. But all of this was exciting to me, and the result was that I ended up with my first award, which was the TOYM, when I was 28.
So 2 years later.
And I became the youngest administrator of a national program, which was rural electric.
national
So that's how it
electrification.
started. And then when things were not going too well with the martial law, I decided maybe I should go somewhere else, Muna, and I ended up in the World Bank,
Okay.
where I stayed for about 10 years. And to some extent, I thought that was it. I was just going to be a World Bank guy for the rest of my life.
Sure. What did you do in the world? What did you do in the World Bank?
I was made in charge of a number of countries for designing their lending programs.
Okay.
And
Was the Philippines part of it?
no, if you were Filipino, you couldn't do Philippines.
I see,
So that you'd be objective, detached.
Objective, yeah.
And then along comes EDSA,
Yeah.
and to my surprise, some people who were close to the incoming administration called me up and
Mentioned
asked
it,
me if I cared to come back and help things out.
Yes.
These were primarily Manny Pelayas again and Jobo Fernandez. So
That's EDSA?
yeah,
After
post
EDSA?
No, after EDSA.
Post EDSA.
Because Jobo had a job, no? Jobo
yeah.
was again
BSP.
BSP, yes.
Central Bank.
At the time, I
Then
was
Central Bank.
at the time I was earning dollars that were tax free, and I'm in the United States, you know.
Of course, you're
So I told them, well, how can I just leave this? But then, you know, sometimes I have these things that challenge is more important than the income. So I had to speak to my family and so forth, and it was supposed to be on a temporary basis lang. I helped them for 2 years and go back to the World Bank. But eventually, Cory appointed me as chairman of DBP, and now I had to make a choice. I can't be both the chairman and the World Bank guy. Well, as you know, the rest is history.
The rest is
I ended up choosing to stay in the Philippines and help out, and eventually
It's not a-
President Ramos succeeded President Aquino, and my public service just continued.
There's no regret about.
Pardon?
There's no regrets about
Oh no,
your
none at all,
choice.
none at
You're
all.
always-
Because it's part of my, you might say, attitude
Yeah.
that it's better. A life lived in the service of others is more meaningful than trying to just pile up
And the great thing was
profits.
that you were seeing a country that was in shambles.
Yes,
I mean,
Grow.
you know,
grow.
can
And
imagine
I
it
was,
prosper.
to some extent, on the inside, not only as an observer, but an active participant in designing policies
exactly.
that
Have you
would
written your
help the
memoirs
country
on
grow.
that, sir?
Pardon?
Have you written your memoirs?
Not yet, but eventually.
That would be a good read. Fantastic.
Yeah,
I
you
mean,
know,
on the insights.
I was even the chairman of the APEC finance ministers at the time the Asian financial crisis erupted. And so I chaired
That
the
was in 2008, right?
no, that's the
before.
that's
Ah, that
this
was
is
the-
1995,
96.
1998.
96.
Yeah.
And
Something.
and you know, we
somewhere-
we crafted together with other finance ministers, including that of the United States, who at that time was Larry Summers, what was then called the Manila Framework, which outlined how to get out of the crisis, how did we get in, and how do we avoid getting in again in the future. So it's been an exciting time, and
Fantastic.
yeah, I might just do the memoirs thing that
Yes,
you're talking
please.
about.
Yeah,
I will be the first to buy your book.
that would be a bestseller.
Pero lang scandal na kasama rin.
So okay, then you became AIM.
After Secretary of Finance,
You became the head.
I had to.
Your Secretary of Finance stint was very, very,
Memorable.
very productive and very well. You had a lot of stellar recognition for that.
Thank you. You know, sometimes I get asked by people, what does it take to be a successful finance secretary? And I tell them, the first thing you have to do is to make sure you pick the right boss.
Your boss then was FVR.
FVR.
How was it working with him?
He, oh my gosh, he led by example. Nobody worked harder than him. So you had to keep up. But aside from that, he was not a politician. So we weren't spending an inordinate amount of our time manufacturing photo ops and, sound bites.
was really action,
Instead, he had one focus, Philippines 2000. The question was,
Fantastic.
where do you want to see the Philippines by the year 2000? And what do you, as a cabinet member, do to contribute to making that effort happen? So all of us had to go along that particular trajectory. And even though he wasn't a politician, he was adept at managing politicians.
Yes.
Which is why, if you think back, he's the
Remarkable.
only president, I think even up to now, that convened the LEDAC
Yes.
almost weekly.
Wow.
These were senators and congressmen. And as a result, it was almost like a parliament where we would reach agreement with the legislative branch of government on
And
what
push it,
are the
push it.
priority legislative measures that will drive the economy forward. So pick the right boss, as I said. And if I had a policy idea, like tax reform, for example, which originated in my office, and I talked to him about it, and he gets convinced that it's something to push forward, then you can be sure that he'll back you up
Yeah,
without dilly-dallying. He'll back you up, and that's very important for a cabinet member, that you don't have a president who will waffle in case, like tax, in case there are elements that will make him
Yes,
unpopular
very
if there is
contentious.
if there is a part of the proposal that is
Policies.
politically sensitive.
And you mentioned that the forerunner of most of the reform measures happened during your period. During
Yes,
your-
for
Sure.
example, what we call the comprehensive tax reform measure was actually started during President Ramos's time, and it was crafted in the Department of Finance when I was secretary, so it's called the CTRP. And my strategy then was born of the observation that every time we are short of finances, because you get it from taxation and borrowings, but mainly taxation, we end up coming up with some new tax. And so we keep piling up new taxes and new taxes and new taxes, but most of these taxes were aiming at the same tax group. So you end up either trying to squeeze more out of the same tax group, or you end up indirectly incentivizing them to go around your your measures. So my strategy was, why don't we rationalize the tax system by lowering
simplifying.
the tax rates, simplifying the brackets, and expanding our tax collection by broadening the base rather than taxing the same base all the time. So that's what we did. At the time we were reviewing tax measures, for example, there must have been at least 9 different ways to tax, say, liquor.
9.
Yeah, it was almost ridiculous. You would be taxed differently if you bought it in a sari-sari store, taxed differently if you bought it in a hotel, taxed differently if you bought it in a hotel that was in a province, on and on and on and on like this. But
There's a lot of loopholes.
and that's just an example. So what we did was, first we shortened the number of brackets, because we noticed that sometimes if you're in this tax bracket, when your income goes up and you're in this other bracket, your actual take-home income goes down because the taxation level is higher. Okay, it didn't make sense. So we rationalized it, we shortened the number of brackets, but then of course we simplified the forms themselves that you report your taxes. That was CTRP. But we also spearheaded what is now known as the public-private partnership.
Correct.
At that time, it was called the BOT,
BOT.
or
Yeah,
the
build,
Build,
operate,
Operate, and Transfer, and it had its variants.
Who is the one who authored BOT?
Well, it was generated inside the Department of Finance, so committee and so forth. You discuss this thing. Why did we do it? Because at that time the country was suffering from brownouts.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Oh,
as
so it's for the
almost
energy
every
sector.
week you had brownouts. So
Oh, yeah.
if your electric power
yeah.
infrastructure is that bad, then how can industry flourish?
Yes.
And how can you attract foreign investments? But this was all happening at a time when the government coffers were very low
Oh, yeah.
because of what happened previously. So you can't instantly make them higher. So we had to think of something else, and that's how we ended up attracting private sector, both here and outside the Philippines, to be investors even in infrastructure.
Power.
And was it a success? But
Oh yeah, because brownouts ended.
ended, yes.
And after that, we started applying the same principle.
But wasn't there a controversy? There was a controversy.
There was a controversy in later years
Yes.
because some politicians have a tendency to make pa-charming by judging a decision made 10 years ago under the circumstances they are now.
Circumstances.
So when power rates were high, they started blaming that because the agreements that were signed during the date were too high and unfair, and so forth and so on. Forgetting that if you didn't do that, you'd have no economy to talk about.
Be in a deeper problem.
So
Correct,
that
yes.
was that was the other major thing. The third one was outright, in a sense, the privatization strategy.
Hold on. But you also, it was during your term, first, during FBR's term, and also your term, the privatization of the telecommunication the opening up of the telecommunications companies.
We called
telecommunications industry.
yes.
Broke up PLDT and all that.
That's right. I don't know if you remember this, but during the early part of the President Ramos's term, Lee Kuan Yew came on a state visit,
Yes.
and being blunt, as Lee Kuan Yew was, he said in his speech in front of the president that we had the worst telephone system in
I
all of
remember
ASEAN.
that. Yes.
Right? If you
Lee
dial
Kuan
it,
Yew.
you either don't get go anywhere or you get the wrong number.
Or somebody answers.
And
So, I
that
was
Don't
getting,
intend.
during the time I was
talk
getting
to.
all the telephone bills of the Kuangkos
yeah.
in my,
So
in my monthly. What the heck is this all
that
about?
incentivized the president to think in terms of reprivatizing the PLDT and then introducing mobile telephony, which was
That
which was
really
in
brought
its
us to the
infancy.
21st century.
Yeah, as a result, no, we became the leading country
Boy.
in mobile telephony, and we didn't have to invest so much anymore on landlines. In fact, we were ahead of the U.S. in mobile telephony. There was
Yes,
there was a
yeah.
time when I'd go visit some relatives in my family in the U.S. and they'd be surprised that we had all these things on the and the U.S. actually was a little late in getting into it because they had invested so much already on landlines that their existing companies would have to have a transition period.
resistance.
So we
Whereas we didn't have that many landlines, so we ended up
went into mobile.
we went to mobile.
Yes, fantastic.
That's 1990s.
1990s, we
early
became the leader in mobile telephony,
remember just to get a telephone
texting.
line.
There's more texting done in the Philippines than in U.S. Europe combined. Even ringtones were invented by our people here. So those were the other things. But then there were other privatization matters which have made an impact. For example, a lot of people want to take pride in BGC, right? But that entire place used to be Fort Bonifacio, a military camp. And we decided to sell it to the private sector to raise funds to modernize the armed forces of the Philippines and
So
relocate.
that was the original intention of
That was really the intention. And as a result, you have now a very modern, bustling metropolis in BGC.
yes.
Hold on, sir. Since we're getting to the more interesting part of the discussions, we're taking a break for now. So hold on.
Well, it was a fast first.
Nasa kamay mo ang swerte, ngunit hindi ito isang laro na para lang sa'yo. Dahil bukod sa pag-asang maging milyonaryo, ang pagtangkilik mo sa loto at iba pang produkto ng PCSO ay nakakalikom ng pondo para sa mga programang pangkalusugan, tulong at serbisyong medikal at kawang-gawa.
Lahat ng minimiting makakamtan sa PCSO.
Iba ng panahon, ang dami ng bago ngayon. Pati ang mundo natin, well, nagbago na rin. Buti ang magbayan, bigger, better na. You can buy it sa centers, pati sa mga partners, may online pa at app. You can buy it with your fingers, still don't remittance and more. Online shopping, you can buy it all. Di magpadala, you can buy it all. Anumang pera transaction, you can buy it all.
Sabayan ang pagbabago ng mundo for all your pera transactions, all new Bayan.
With Globe, our steps can lead us to millions of doors opening, millions of paths unfolding, and millions of reasons to keep going. Now's the time to be with a network that gets better every day for you.
Nasa kamay mo ang swerte, ngunit hindi ito isang laro na para lang sa'yo. Dahil bukod sa pag-asang maging milyonaryo, ang pagtangkilik mo sa loto at iba pang produkto ng PCSO ay nakakalikom ng pondo para sa mga programang pangkalusugan, tulong at serbisyong medikal at kawang-gawa.
Lahat ng minimiting makakamtan sa PCSO.
Hello, we're back, mga katribu. So, we still have Mr. Ocampo here touching on most of the finance experiences in his being the
Finance Secretary.
finance secretary. So, can you take us back to your 10 Outstanding Young Man Awards, sir?
But that was one. That was
Simplified
my first award, and it was to recognize what I had done to develop and implement the National Electrification Program and establish the National Electrification Administration, which then provided electricity to more than what was then at the time, just 30% of the population.
Under
So I
your
was only, when I got the award, I was not even 30 years old.
you're 28 years old.
Yeah.
How much more was electrified?
We started off with 36 electric cooperatives, in something like 3 per main island grouping, as the initial, and therefore we're able to bring it up from just 30% to 50%, and then establish the mechanisms by which future administrations can just keep moving it forward.
I see.
It does have its problems now, but that's another matter.
This is not water, yeah. Okay.
When before the break, we were talking about the Maharlika Fund.
Oh,
So-
that. Okay.
Okay.
Could you
That
just maybe very
Your
briefly?
views.
What are your thoughts?
Maybe you
what are your
can-
thoughts about that?
you can share with us
You
your
know,
thoughts about that.
The first time it was proposed, some people also asked me what I thought of it, and I had to think of some kind of a diplomatic response.
Diplomatic.
So I said, well, it's probably a good idea whose time has not yet come. What did I mean by that? The Maharlika Fund is what in international financial circles is called a sovereign wealth fund. Sovereign because it's owned by the state. Wealth because you are trying to take part of the state's financial resources into a bundle of money which you will then invest, hopefully smartly, in different things all over the world in the hope that you get a higher return than if you just deposited it in, say, the bank, BSP. And then you will have much more money to utilize.
To
Okay.
reinvest.
But the problem, the reason why I said whose time has not yet come, is because the wealth also means that the sovereign has to be wealthy enough to set aside funds to make that happen. Which is why those with sovereign wealth funds tend to be the likes of Singapore, Norway. These are countries that have excess funds. I mean, in Norway, they got funds coming out of their ears through oil.
From oil, yes.
So in our case, we don't. And the first time that the Maharlika Fund was proposed, there was even a proposal to fund it from funds from SSS, funds from GSIS, and so forth, which caused a big uproar, because the last thing you want to do with pension funds, which are relied upon by the citizenry when they retire, is to put it at risk, you know?
Yes.
Even though there's a temptation that if you're clever enough to invest properly, you will get a higher return. Sometimes, even if you're clever, external factors in the economy, both locally and internationally, could wipe you out.
Singapore,
Okay? Which happened to
Was
Singapore.
victims.
They didn't get wiped out, but they can afford to lose 300 million. We can't.
So with Norway.
Even Norway, they both invested in cryptocurrency, and you know what happened.
Wiped out.
Okay. So that was put aside. But now they continue to talk about getting dividends from DBP and Land Bank, and including the BSP. Now, that may not be a very smart thing either, because the dividends from Land Bank and DBP are utilized to supplement the national budget. All right?
Yes.
So if you took that out, there are two things that could happen. One is you put it at risk in an investment fund which may or may not work.
Make money.
And if it doesn't make money, then you've lost a chunk of what you need to
your budget.
supplement your budget resources. And at the same time, you in a sense, restrain the growth of two important financial institutions whose purposes are focused. DBP should be focused on financing long-term projects like basic large industries and infrastructure. Land Bank is supposed to focus on financing land reform beneficiaries and the agriculture sector as a whole. Both of these sectors, manufacturing and agriculture, are absolutely important for the basic structure and growth of the Philippine economy. Now, if you hamper the two, and the off chance that you'll make more money, what if you don't?
What if you don't?
Okay, and even if you made more money, who's going to decide how to use it?
Right.
Whereas if you kept it where they are, they have a defined role in their charters for what they will use it, and they are guided by a board and so forth and so on, and not by a political structure. Now, if you take it from the BSP, you know, the BSP has to have enough ammunition,
Reservoir.
so to speak, in order for those moments when you're trying to control inflation, the exchange rate stability, and so forth, which is why over the years it has been important for the country to maintain an adequate capital base for the BSP. Now, if you take that out, you might have handicapped the BSP's ability to be able to fight inflation, particularly in situations that we have now, where the inflation is not coming from us, but we have to react to it because it's coming from the United
external.
States. But when the United States catches a cold, everybody gets pneumonia. Okay. Right now, it caught a cold, and a lot of the world is ending up catching pneumonia because they're holding U.S. treasuries, okay, as part of their financial investments. And because of what the U.S. Monetary Reserve has done, it has decreased the value of the bonds, U.S. treasuries, that all kinds of central banks are holding all over the world. And as a result of that, the BSP right now has lost significant amounts of the value of what their holdings, which in the banking community are called mark-to-market valuation, meaning how much will they cost, how much are they worth to the end point of their existence, the 5-year bond or the 5th year. Bumaba.
So we
Now,
are affected. So the BSP.
yes, but through no fault of theirs, huh? But if you diverted some of their resources into a Maharlika fund, then they will not have the capability to weather that storm.
Buffett.
See? And therefore you created two problems. You created a weaker central bank, and you created a risky proposition.
And it's not working.
But added to this is that we're trying to get into it at a bad time. The entire world is in a bad situation right now, particularly the leading economies, because the U.S. is moving towards recession. I don't think they can escape it. Most financial gurus, even of the United States, are talking along those lines. They've been raising their interest rates progressively month after month, and the inflation continues to be where it is, in the vicinity of 7%. They're trying to bring it down to 2. The only way they can do that is to keep raising and raising interest rates, which will then shrink the economic activity of the country, and of course affect everybody, because we trade in a big time with the United States now. Europe is the same thing. The Russia-Ukraine war has affected them because many of the sanctions that they imposed on Russia apparently have backfired. It's actually Russia that's whose economy is doing better than the economies of Western Europe. Well, because part of their sanctions had to do with not depending or not importing fuel, natural gas from Russia,
And
which was a vast source by pipeline
for Europe.
and lower cost. Now that's gone. So their energy prices have zoomed. Huh?
Yeah,
And
inflation.
Europe has no alternative.
Well, their
but to get
alternative,
some- but to source
right
it from
now, their
Russia.
alternative is reporting at 3 times the cost from the United States and from Norway. So they'll have fuel, but at this cost, and the effectiveness of European manufacturing, particularly in Germany, was based on having low energy
Low-cost
prices, most of which were
Low-cost
coming
energy.
from Russia. So back to the Maharlika, we're thinking about jumping in to an investment situation at a time when the entire investment
bonkers.
environment is a little bit challenging. So if I were them,
Yeah, well, that would be the better option then.
postpone.
Postpone.
Kick it around. You have enough time to refine it and wait for better days, and start looking at other important priorities, because we have to prepare ourselves for a changed world.
Yes, for change.
You're talking about priority. What
Agriculture.
Agriculture.
Energy transitioning. These are your main priorities.
Renewable energy.
Creating jobs, of, strengthening our infrastructure. Those are the priorities.
Talking about priority, you think that the move now to get to change the charter, particularly the economic provisions, is that a wise move?
Yes, you
Do
know,
do you trust Congress enough
well,
to just
I was about to
stay
say,
with it? Yeah.
if the intent is to amend the charter in order to liberalize the economic provisions so that we can have
Foreign
the
direct
benefit
FDIs.
of more foreign direct investment, wonderful. But if it starts moving towards a temptation for keeping themselves in office forevermore, then again that becomes a little bit difficult. How do you solve it? You solve it by having the president, no less, cracking the whip. After all, he has a majority, you know, and he had the biggest landslide in electoral history, and tell them, yeah, I'll go for it, but don't you dare fool around with the political provisions. And of course, I would assume that the speaker, being his first cousin, will happily crack the same whip. And the entire country will benefit from that whip cracking. And they will benefit by passing on a legacy for all time that will uplift the livelihoods of the Filipino people. You know, if you look at foreign direct investment alone, we're being beaten by Vietnam. We're being beaten by Vietnam. We're being beat, and it looks like we're about to be beaten by Indonesia. And part of the reason is because we are, for whatever reason, we're very parochial when it comes to thinking about opening up our economy to foreign investments, where everybody else is opening it. We don't. It took us forever. I mean, forever, no man. It took us a long time. We dragged our feet to kicking and screaming almost to get into something like RCEP when everybody else around us was already in
What
it.
is wrong? I mean, I don't understand the
So-
hesitation.
Yeah.
Well,
There's
at
a
least
lot
they
of
passed it now.
hesitation.
So, you know,
Yes.
sometimes,
won't be.
sometimes, of course, people will ask, bakit naman gano'n? And the only thing you can say is, kasi Philippines is the only country that copied the American democratic political structure. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
Almost identically. And therefore, you know, the endless debating and so forth is more important than getting things done. So that's part of the problem. But getting back to your question, yes, if they amend the charter and behave themselves and just look at the economic provisions, they would have left a legacy. If I were them, I'd think along those lines. The president would have left a legacy that he'll be remembered for all time to come.
Yes.
Well, I hope you have the same
Politicians
same
as
mental view as you have.
There would always be the
You're talking
temptation.
about-
When you open up the Constitution, you can do everything in terms of
Yes, of course. That
amendments.
that is the perception, and of course, our politics being what it is, it's very personalized, and everyone is watching out for how can I personally benefit from this, rather than how can the country benefit from it.
That's why, sir,
So
you're not,
kaya sabi ko,
that's why, sir, you're not in
it's got
Congress.
to be, it's got to be whip cracked from the very top.
About these amendments, the Public Service Act, would that help? In
I'm not aware of that one.
No, they have no.
They
NEDA
have
has just
provided,
issued the implementing rules and
rules and
regulations to the
regulations.
Modified Public Service Act,
which
Oh,
supposedly
oh.
would
which is
the-
allowing
Yes.
That-
foreign
that
100%
helps.
full ownership
Yeah, that
of certain
helps.
that would help.
I don't think
certain
it
industries.
includes telecoms yet, because that is part of the restrictions in the present charter.
Parang, yeah,
See?
I'm
But
not
since
sure.
it's
But
public
it
service,
includes
should
electric
include
power and
all
so forth and so on.
utilities.
I'm not sure. Hopefully, it
Even
did
media,
include that.
I hope they didn't put media there. I don't know.
Yeah, because you know we can
Media.
bring in partners and competitors, etc., etc. Yeah. In fact, that's one of good achievements of the administration so
You
far.
welcome that.
Yeah, pushing for. In fact, my group, I chair a group called the Foundation for Economic Freedom.
Mr.
I'm the
Chicamco.
chairman. Mr. Chicamco is the president. But it's the largest aggregation of the country's top economists, whether they were in academia or the government or what. That's them. No? So we were quite active in helping to package and move the legislation forward on
This public
the
service.
PSA.
In the PSA.
Yeah.
Were you invited also to the hearings on RCEP and CON?
Yes, but most of the time it's my colleagues in FEF that go.
Okay.
How about, can we talk about Veterans Bank? There's a lot of changes that you have initiated in the bank.
Yes.
Mainly digitalization.
Yeah, how did you get into Veterans Bank?
This was
From AIM, no? It
surprisingly.
was after AIM.
Surprisingly enough, it's already 10 years ago. I get surprised sometimes when I think, huh, 10 years back?
10 years, a
10
decade
years.
already.
But
huh?
the background is this, huh? First of all, Philippine Veterans Bank is the only private commercial bank. It's private. Many people think it's government. It's the
Oh, is it?
only
Yeah, I saw that.
private commercial bank that is both a bank and a monument. It's a monument because it was
Veterans.
established for the purpose of honoring the World War II veterans who are responsible in large part for giving us the freedom that we all enjoy now.
Yes.
And these were people who, in those times, were barely out of their teens, were ROTC cadets, and decided to take on the Japanese Imperial Army.
Wow, yeah.
So, of course, the nation feels that it owes them a debt of gratitude
Yeah.
and put up this bank in order that there will be a continuing institutional capability to provide financial assistance to the veterans and their families,
Families.
beyond what the government itself could provide. So
When was it established?
1962.
1962.
Now, it was established through Japanese reparations, which were then given to the veterans, who in turn put it back into the bank to
How
be
it
their
was,
No, no,
to be
was it public?
to be their equity.
Did it
No,
start
no,
as
no.
a
It was
public?
given out to the veterans.
The
So
veterans.
each
So
who's
veteran
Oh.
Each
Then
veteran
put
receive-
in these funds so that aside from being both a bank and a monument, it's probably the most widely owned
owned.
because there are
most
several thousand
inclusive.
veterans.
Who was the first president? Or the
Oh
first
God,
one?
I don't remember.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think it's Terry a divorce or something.
Divorce,
Anyway,
yeah.
but that's unfortunately, as the years went by,
As years went by,
many
yeah.
many of them were heroes but not bankers,
Yes.
and as a result, the bank went in the wrong
yeah, of
direction
course.
and was shut down sometime
It's a
during
bank.
the 70s.
Mm.
And then later on, they made an appeal to President Aquino and subsequently President Ramos to revive the bank. And so it was reopened sometime after, it was an interregnum, sometime towards the end of President Aquino and towards the beginning of President Ramos. It was reopened. But it was reopened with, again, a set of veterans, etc., who, to some extent, were being hoodwinked by professional bankers whom they hired and were pulling the wool over their eyes. And so the Veterans Bank started moving again towards closure in 2013.
2013. So matagal-tagal din
2012,
siya.
2013. At that time, it was both the Department of Finance and the BSP thought that perhaps we can still rescue these things, kawawa naman the veterans, if this thing goes down the drain, and we end up, instead of honoring them, giving them a slap on the face. So they
that's when
approached
you
me
came in.
Who
to
approached
see,
you? Sir?
Tetanco
Mm.
and Cesar Porissima and some members of the Monetary Board, notably Peter Favila and Freddy Antonio, and asked me if I could go in there and rescue the bank. You know, I guess I had a reputation for rescuing things here and there, and at the time I had already been publicly announced to be the incoming chairman of Bank of Commerce, which was entering into a partnership with a large Malaysian bank called CIMB. So I told them, "No, I can't do it because, I'm committed." But at the very last second, and there's
The
also a
last
cuento
second.
behind that, which has two sides to it. The deal fell through between
CIMB.
Ramon Ang and CIMB,
Okay.
and so I was reapproached to get in there, and I ran out of excuses. So the only thing I could say was, okay, but you have to back me up 100% because I have to be draconian. And they said, "What do you mean by draconian?" I might have to set aside the existing board, including my uncle, and change all the senior officers and the governance mechanisms
That's draconian.
just for starters. Anyway, that all took place over a number of years, but it still had a capitalization which was below the regulatory 10 billion for a
requirement.
private commercial bank, but that was built into the charter.
This is what year, sir?
This is
20
before the pandemic.
2019.
Yeah. But interestingly enough, even while we hadn't changed the charter, we had the largest posted profit for that bank towards just before the pandemic set in, and before we had even done anything about changing the charter.
So first quarter 2020.
Then the pandemic comes in, and we decided that we're not going to waste our time during the pandemic, just locking ourselves down, and that's when we pushed for charter change. See, which
Charter change
included
for the
the Philippine
the bank,
Veterans
yeah.
Bank, because you had to go back to Congress since the charter was was a piece of law. So
You
that
would-
included expanding the base from World War II to all veterans and so forth, and expanding the capital from what it was, about 3 billion to 10. So that charter change was signed by President Duterte a couple of years, 2 years ago, and we've been working to get people to come in and invest in order for us to be able to fill the gap between where it is and the 10 billion that we aspire for, which is all very important, not only to follow regulatory provisions on minimum capitalization, but also because if you don't have that kind of a capitalization, then you don't have the leverage to be able to expand the bank's operations and income and so forth and so on, which are all very important to be able to help the veteran community as well as the entire economy. So we were able to get charter change, and now we are in the process of getting equity in. Fortunately, we have a big chunk that came in recently, courtesy of some members of the sons and daughters of the World War II veterans. And now we are in talks. In fact, 2 weeks ago, I had a chat with the Chief of Staff, General Centino, in order to enlist his aid in convincing other veterans to be investors in Philippine Veterans Bank, and of course
These
to
are now the ordinary
of
veterans.
well, the veterans of other wars, like the Korean War and so forth, and so on, plus those that had retired from the armed forces and are now considered
retired
veterans.
soldiers.
And then, of course, I laid out a vision of positioning the Philippine Veterans Bank as the primary financial institution for the armed forces itself.
Armed forces.
So
You don't need to be veterans.
I think we could succeed to get healthy enough equity from the veteran community, because as I understood it from General Centino, there are about 160,000 veterans of the non-World War II variety.
Oh, that's a huge number.
If there's 160,000,
160,000.
if they contribute, say, an average of 10,000 pesos each, then I've got 1.6 billion.
Yes. But you said AFP. Including
Yes,
the
yes,
AFP.
of course.
Non-veterans.
they-
Non-veterans.
The AFP part of
Veterans.
it may not just necessarily be in terms of investing equity, but in terms of treating the Philippine Veterans Bank as their priority financial institution for their borrowing needs, for their small and
For the
medium
AFP,
enterprise,
yes.
for AFP families, things of this sort.
So that the Veterans Bank would be transitioning to something like an ordinary commercial bank.
No, it's not transition. It is a private commercial bank from the get-go, but it's the only private commercial bank
Which is a more
with a congressional charter.
I
And
see.
within the charter, the only one that can deal with
The veterans.
local government and national government entities. So we are an official government depository as well.
Okay.
And we're the only ones like that among
There was
the
the
private
charter
commercial.
change.
That was already in the old charter.
Okay.
It wasn't changed. So we continue to have that
Oh.
capability. But as of the end of 2022, we again were back into profit picture. And if we now have
Have
this,
you made? Were you in
yes,
the black?
yes, we're in the black. But now that there's fresh equity coming in, we expect this to continue and increase over time, which would allow us to have the ammunition,
Terrific. Yeah.
resources to help the veteran community.
Mhm.
Not to mention, of course, that we cleaned up the governance mechanisms. I like to tell people that, I have a board there that I can compare favorably to any other bank in the Philippines, regardless of its size. I mean, we're probably the only bank that has 3 ex-bank presidents in it. We've
Really?
got,
Who are these?
we've got Pepo Nunez, who was chairman of DBP. And then there's me. I'm the only guy who's been chairman of both DBP and Land Bank.
Land bank.
And then we have Chito Magsaho, who was the president of RCBC. Yeah. And
You're in good company.
oh yeah, I selected them. I selected
Handpicked.
and convinced them. Until their term ended last year, our governance independent director was Nieves Confessor,
Oh, Neves. Yeah.
so she's Secretary of Labor.
Yes.
And our audit committee chair was the recently retired lady chair of Price Waterhouse.
Oh.
So
Impressive.
Yeah, quite an impressive setup you have.
the good thing about it is that they thought it was a good cause to support. I mean, it's not. They could have gone to some other bigger bank, but they decided that the challenge is worth it.
And you're going to more of the digitalization.
Definitely.
Just-
We've started that already, and we are going to do our share in helping the BSP in its objective of inclusive banking by spreading it out and making banking transactions easier.
Fantastic. Yeah.
So,
See, we had an interesting discussion earlier, but well, of course, this is a little bit more broad. I mean, outside of the field, we were talking about this particular think piece that that you just wrote for
Oh,
the Makati Business Club.
I am at the business club.
that is more geopolitical, and I'm sure you're referring to the column that was released about 2 weeks ago.
Yes.
You see, I write every quarter, and it's published in the Daily Inquirer. And the last time I wrote one, which was published 2 weeks ago, the title was Abangan. No?
Abangan.
But it went into a brief analysis of what's taking place worldwide in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war, which is a proxy war between the United States and Russia, the effect of all that on the leading economies, the cascading effect on the rest of the world. And that's what I wrote. And one of the things that is important is for us in the Philippines to have a consciousness of what's taking place, because I called what is taking place tectonic shifts, meaning very major shifts
It's a
in the
very
balance of
appropriate.
power, the structure of the international financial community, and the change in the way things have been done since the end of World War II. The key to it all, or the main element, seems to be a evolution from what is called a unipolar world, meaning there is one big dominant country that practically tells everybody else what to do, and who is in charge of practically the entire financial mechanism of the entire world, and that's the United States,
Yeah.
with the US dollar the dominant currency, towards what is now being called a multipolar world, where there may be other economies rising with as much strength as the United States, and therefore may have currencies that are as valid and strong. Right now, China is listed in some publications, including the IMF, as the largest economy. It used to be the United States.
Yeah.
But of course, there's some debate as to how you measure it. But whether they're one or two, China cannot be ignored. It is
Cannot be
the
ignored.
second or the biggest.
Definitely.
Just over the past month, India
India is coming in also.
overtook the United Kingdom as the fourth or fifth largest economy in the world. And now the two of them, together with a few other countries, are part of an international aggregation who's known as BRICS, BRICS. That's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Walang United States dyan, walang Western Europe. And the BRICS is intended to have a new trade configuration that does not depend always on West. It's like Philippines. Most of our trade before had to be with United States and Western Europe.
Sugar quota.
And up to now, quite a chunk of it is over there. It's only actually during President Ramos' time that he started deliberately taking trips to the ASEAN countries in order to expand our trade beyond them. But the rest of the world, it's similar to that in a sense that they all depended on trading with the West. If you want to look at it cynically, the West was using the resources of everybody else in order to maintain its standard of living.
That is always the way.
Diba?
that-
So, United States, for example, in order to maintain its level of standard of living, borrows all over the place. Okay, and this is what augments their tax resources. But people go ahead and lend them money because they're a strong country. Of course, they'll pay us back and so forth and so on.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, because of this Russia-Ukraine crisis, there has been a perception in many countries that the U.S. weaponized the dollar. In other words, their sanctions against countries were tied to their ability to access their own bank accounts, which are in dollars. As a result, many countries are taking moves for what they call de-dollarization.
Dollarization.
In other words, changing the composition of their reserves from just predominantly dollars to a mixed bag that includes dollars and other currencies like the Russian ruble, the Chinese yuan, and so forth,
Russia's military.
and selling down their U.S. treasuries in large amounts, which is not seen before, and replacing this with gold, with the intention that their aggregation of countries will come up with a new valuation of currencies based on gold and not based on the dollar.
Okay.
So these are the changes that are taking place in the global economy, aside from changing the financial mechanisms that are involved in trade. One of those mechanisms is called the petrodollar. The petrodollar was devised by an agreement between the United States and the oil-producing exporting countries, so that all payments of this are in dollars. But now OPEC countries are accepting payments in other currencies. So we have to keep watching this. Should we stock up on gold ourselves? My suggestion is do it.
Do it.
Because we have one of the biggest gold reserves in the world. It's just sitting there in Mindanao.
Really?
Yes, and it's being smuggled. And
Yeah.
we should instead get a chunk of it to shore up our
National
own
treasure.
gold reserves.
So on that note, Mr. De Ocampo, thank you.
Are we
again.
done?
Uy, tapos na ba?
Jesus Christ, I thought we were just wrapping up.
Yeah, we're just warming up, but I guess
Oh my goodness.
the time has caught up with us.
I told you this is a very refreshing interview.
Maybe we should have another episode.
Part 2, yeah, maybe after.
I will be
after
happy
this.
to do it for you if you
Jesus
invite
Christ.
me again.
Or you can write every week for us.
I'm struggling with a quarterly column.
Thank you again
Yeah,
for.
before we, let's talk about the FVR website or something.
yeah,
the
yeah,
library,
so-
the library.
Yeah.
Just last Saturday, on the occasion of the 95th birth anniversary of President Ramos, we
President.
launched.
I'm a big fan of Fidel Ramos.
We launched the first ever digital presidential library.
Fantastic.
And we are compiling, we had compiled in it, I became the chairman of this project, and we compiled in it all sorts of works and documents and so forth during his presidency, as well as a biographical sketch that goes back to his childhood, his becoming a soldier, etc.
Sure,
It can be accessed now by going into fvrlegacy.com.
FVR.
And
Legacy.
yes,
FVRlegacy.com.
and the value will be to those that wish to research presidential decision making, or even the biography of one of our greatest presidents. And of course, he was a trailblazer. And
I'm sorry?
He was a trailblazer.
A trailblazer,
So that
yes.
people around the world would be interested in the things he did and how he decided to do those things and so forth and so on. And now that it's there as a digital library, that's better than if you had a physical library. But masunog yung physical library. This one is there for all time to come.
That's great. That's terrific.
So
Who are you with in this?
Angel Ramos, his daughter,
Oh, okay.
and then the staff of what
Or-
is
or-
called
or-
There was a
RP Dev.
there was a guy before that I became friends with, and he was like an aide. He
That's the
was,
website right there. You're showing it.
oh, there you got it. Ang bilis nila.
I love the books of the former president.
We haven't gotten to that kasi dami-dami, but this
you're-
is a work in progress. So we continue to input things as we
But eventually,
sort them out.
you would be
Eventually, we hope it will be. This will be complete,
downloadable
and
for
then,
free.
then also that we might even have a physical library.
Were you among those who were victimized by the late President Ramos?
Victimized.
Victimized in terms of waking up at 4 o'clock and then
Oh my gosh!
playing golf,
You know,
talking, and starting.
not only
Oh boy, he
was my I was his favorite golf partner, and so when
Did you play
he'd have-
Kanlubang?
I played Kanlubang.
Everywhere.
Yeah. And so whenever he'd have a dignitary from abroad who's a golfer, etc., and he'd invite them to play somewhere, man, I'd get a 4 a.m. call. Wow, partner tayo, ah.
Yes, sir. He had a staff member who was always with him and said, "My God, can you imagine we were in a Scandinavian country and he wakes me up in this freezing cold.
Yeah,
Just
wake
to
me
play
up
golf.
but
at
hindi lang
3
yan, ah.
o'clock, let's play golf."
But that's not all. My gosh, by
Or
5
jog,
by 5
sometimes.
a.m. he would have read all the newspaper clippings, and if he finds something that's relevant to your department, you'll get a call. I'm sleeping there. It's 4:30. Bobby, nakita mo ba ito nandito sa diaryo?
How can I do that? I'm still asleep.
Can I miss the guy? I really
Amazing.
miss him. I miss having a
So,
president like him.
So, Mr. Ocampo, thank you again for gracing us with your presence. I'm Chito Lozada.
Teddy, and I am Teddy Montelibano. And this has been Straight
This has been Straight Talk. See you next week.
Thank you.